Welcome to this episode of Orthodontics in Interview. It's my absolute pleasure to bring you guys Professor Parag Fleming. So, Parag has been a mentor of mine in the past, and I'm really excited to have finally got him onto this podcast. I will not tell you how many times I've asked him, but I'm glad that he's here. And a bit of background about Parag. So, Parag is the chair of orthodontics at Trinity College in Dublin. He was a former professor in orthodontics at Queen Mary's University of London. That's where he was my mentor. He's also achieved a phenomenal amount within our profession of orthodontics. So he's an associate editor of the AJODO, the BDJ, Progress in Orthodontics. He's published over 150 peer-reviewed publications. Numerous awards. I won't make myself feel any more inferior by going through them all, but recently he won the Turpin Award in the AAO from last year. Parag has published a number of textbooks. Most notably, he's the recent author with Graeber's Orthodontics, Current Principles and Techniques, that landmark publication and book within all of our orthodontic education. He's also a co-blogger with Kevin O'Brien on Kevin O'Brien's author blog and has started his own Facebook group, which is Orthodontic Fundamentals. Now, with that, he runs his own course, which runs about every quarter, which is Orthodontic Fundamentals, a phenomenal course. And I do suggest to anybody interested in learning more about evidence-based orthodontics, do go on his course. The next iteration is going to be in February on the 11th and 12th of 2023. So please do check that out. Parag, welcome to Orthodontics in Interview.
Thank you, Farouk. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm sorry I've been a little bit elusive in terms of making this happen, but it's great to be here.
No problem. All is forgiven, the fact that you've turned up. So, Parag, I wanted to get into the first bit of it. I mean, your research pedigree is second to none, and really, I want to know what triggered that interest into clinical orthodontics. Where did that come from?
Well, I say Farouk, probably right at the start. I think, even as a dental student, I was, I guess quite academic, quite a hard worker. I think I'm very fortunate that I always enjoyed even dentistry. And once I started orthodontics, it certainly did become my passion. So I think I knew right from the start that it was the career for me. I think I was very fortunate in, some of the trainers that I had, really good orthodontists, but also, very evidence informed, very keen to undertake, in particular, clinical research. So I think in one sense, I was very, very fortunate. I guess I also had an inquiring mind. And fundamentally, I've always enjoyed orthodontics and tried to do things well and better. And I think what better way to learn orthodontics than actually to evaluate what we do, whether it's the cases that we treat or potentially, new innovations and new interventions. And obviously, research is a fantastic way of doing that. So for me, it was the interest in research per se, but it was also actually trying to get a little bit better at what we do, and similarly understanding, my own abilities and treatments that little bit better.
That's interesting. And kind of on that note of your journey so far, recently you've moved from the UK, from London, where I'm from, and you've moved to Dublin in Ireland. So why has it happened? What did I do?
Well, it wasn't quite your fault, Farouk, but I have been asked this question a lot over the last few months, obviously. It was a very, very difficult decision for us. We loved London. I loved working, at Queen Mary, and had a fantastic, 17 years basically in the UK. I think a major reason is because Ireland is home, and that I guess that feeling never left me, and never left my wife either. So that was a big factor. Equally, I was trained in Dublin, Trinity College in Dublin. It's a fantastic institution, really, really nice part of Dublin, and Dublin itself is a great city. I feel like I'm selling it now. Uh,
I'm
but that
coming.
was a major factor. Yeah, that absolutely. You're very welcome. But that was a major factor for me. And since we've got back, we have really enjoyed it, and I'd like to think that we're building, hopefully, a really good program in Dublin as well. It was already good, but I'd like to think that we can strengthen it further. So it's also, I think, on a professional level, a really good opportunity as well, to shape something new and a little bit different.
It's really interesting. People speaking to people like yourself, Parag, is that there's always a new challenge that they can derive, even though from the outside it looks as though you've accomplished it all by that point in time. But you still seem to find more mountains to climb. I do not have that stamina. So, just talking about your clinical research, I mean, there's so many topics that you've covered, Parag, over the years, both in primary studies and systematic reviews, class twos, functional appliances, self-ligation, your PhD. But you've had a kind of a direction of change, if I may say, looking more towards retention. What led you into retention as a topic to explore?
Well, I think, if we're honest, we all know retention is, the problem in orthodontics. I think we all have different approaches to retention. It's interesting. I think we'll probably talk about social media later on, Farouk, but if you look at Facebook groups, you see numerous people who only use fixed retention and others who never use fixed retention. So it really does divide opinion. And similarly, that there is, I think, quite a bit of uncertainty around the optimal approach. So I think really that has fascinated me. I think on a personal level, again, there's an element of this being, about getting better. And I know, when I finished as maybe a registrar or a trainee, I always kind of said to myself, I would like to consider at the end of my 3 years of training that I will be fully trained, that I will be a specialist and ready to act as such. However, when it came to retention, if I was honest, that was not the case. My bond retainers were not secure. They did come off. My failure rate was far, far too high. So I think there was a sense where I needed to get better myself, and maybe that informed, to a degree, my research interest around that. But similarly, I do think there are unanswered questions, and technology has really influenced, how we undertake active orthodontic treatment, in recent years, and particularly, I would say, around kind of the process of treatment rather than necessarily the outcome. That hasn't really been the case, I would say, with retention quite so much. So I think now that newer technologies are coming online, I'm beginning to think there are lots of potential avenues and things that we can adjust moving forward and hopefully, innovate and develop. That really is the thing that I continue actually to be most focused on.
That's interesting, and you mentioned kind of. I want to address also the topic of social media. So, you started your Facebook group only a few years ago, and it's got 8,000 followers. It's very active in kind of pumping out information about your cases, but also looking at evidence based. It kind of accomplishes both sides of that kind of spectrum. But I really want to know what your thoughts were about where we are going as a field or recipients of information when it comes to looking at this kind of non-peer review process. I mean, someone who's had so many publications and books and so forth, they've gone through that standardized, this is bona fide, and colleagues have said it's okay. But actually, social media is in a different platform, a different place. So I'm interested to know why you started it and kind of where you see it going forwards as in a broader sense.
In terms of why I started it, I think probably by accident. I think, it was again during lockdown, as so many, good and bad ideas, I guess, were developed during lockdown. Obviously I was working from home, doing my best to teach still from home, spending some time on the Peloton on the bike, and maybe I had a brainwave when I was on the Peloton. And plus a lot of people had been telling me that I need to get into social media. And I think on reflection, I think it probably was a good idea. I think the idea of the group is that it is about the fundamentals, and I think certainly when I look at quite a lot of social media, I see people quite often being very fascinated with newer techniques, and I'm all about innovation and new techniques, and I think it's really important that we do innovate, but at the same time they've got to be used in the right way in the right situations, and that's where clearly the fundamentals come in. So an example in my case is that, I've described myself as a probably medium volume user of TADS. And that's because, I feel I do lots of other things to manage anchorage. And I'd like to think I'm quite thoughtful around my treatment planning. As you know, Farouk, the Royal London, we're steeped in kind of space planning, for example. So I tend to think about alternatives before I place TADS because I just see a slightly higher degree of invasiveness and potentially more possible complications. So I think the fundamentals are key, and they will never grow old or irrelevant. So that was, I suppose, kind of the main stimulus for getting involved. In terms of the group itself, I'm probably not as frequent a poster as I should be because of all the other priorities that we've got in life. But hopefully, we do keep it relatively fresh. In
Where do you
terms of
see that going? Yes,
yeah.
where do you see it going? Where do you see that going as an outlet to get information? I mean, versus the peer review process. If I can be so frank, social media versus peer review. Where do you think we should stand? Where do you think it fits in?
Yeah. Well, I think, if we look at, obviously Kevin is the, I suppose the forebearer in ortho of this in terms of kind of, looking at research, hopefully distilling it and making it accessible to people and giving his own perspective on it. I suppose within the Facebook group, I attempt to do that probably in a more simplified form even. And I think in a sense that is useful because we know that research quite often doesn't really penetrate where it needs to. The people who really need to hear about research often aren't quite listening. And that's not necessarily their fault. It may be academics' fault as well, in that we don't necessarily get our message out there. I've used the analogy around self-ligating brackets. Marketers say one thing, marketers' job is to get people to listen. Researchers are saying something quite different. And unfortunately, because the marketers are so good at getting their message out, we're never heard as researchers.
Mm.
So, hopefully social media is a way of reaching people. It's a way of, equally, certainly I see my sort of role there as a way of kind of distilling information, making it accessible, giving my own perspective, but obviously always sharing, openly, freely available papers so that people can read the paper and draw their own conclusions if they don't agree with me. So that's kind of how I feel my kind of, role being. I think in terms of the whole kind of ecosystem, I think you're right. I think, historically we had, print journals only. Now we have print and online, and the online are competing with social media. And I think if we're honest, I think people probably go to social media more these days for academic information than they do our orthodontic journals. So that presents challenges, but I suppose in one sense presents opportunities. If we have the right people, hopefully with the time and the willingness to share their thoughts, I think it can make that information a little bit more accessible.
Very good. And now just a little bit more about you, Parag. So you're a busy man, to say the least, but I want to know, what do you do when you're not thinking about orthodontics? So what kind of things do you get up to with the family?
Well, lots. I first of all, hugely into sports, but sadly, primarily based on the armchair these days. So what I've enjoyed historically in terms of sport is probably golf mainly. I do love skiing as well. I think it's a family pursuit. It's fantastic. So I like activity-based holidays. So skiing is probably what we enjoy most together as a family. So we certainly try to do that at least once a year.
Great. So, Parag, the next question that I wanted to ask, which is a bit of a hot potato here, but what is your favorite journal in orthodontics?
Well, I think Farouk, I can't answer that one as there's no associate editor of more than one journal. But what I would say is that I think these days, probably what we need to think about in an era when social media is so pervasive and so powerful is open access and equally efficient publication, because, we're in an environment when there is so much change and flux. So I think they are the priorities. I think there are lots of very good orthodontic journals out there, however. In all seriousness, though, I would say one point that I should make is around predatory publications. And these quite often, I think, are referred to actually in social media groups. And in fact, I do see them even on some orthodontic social media groups. And essentially, these are journals which will publish really at any cost, and they'll publish almost any material. So I would just caution that we need to be a little bit careful around some of the, journal-based information that we're reading these days. And in particular, that issue does relate to predatory publications.
Excellent point and incredibly well dodged question, Parag. I must credit
Okay.
you with that. So, looking at kind of just again going back to your journey, Parag. So, having achieved a number of things you've done, there must have been a number of kind of barriers and hurdles along the way. But what was the biggest barrier you faced in your career, and how did you find yourself navigating it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Rick. I mean, I suppose always time, was an issue. I think I've been very fortunate. My wife just walked in, but I've had a very supportive wife and family who have kind of allowed me, overwork, I suppose, over the years. But I think in all honesty, I was very fortunate, with my training, with some of the people that surrounded me during my training. So genuinely, they didn't put barriers in front of me; they put carrots in front of me. And I think that's really important. That's something that I've always tried to do with my own trainees, and be it masters or PhD students as well, is to encourage people, to nurture them. And I was fortunate enough to have been treated in that way myself, throughout my training.
Excellent. And kind of looking at things going forwards now, what kind of challenges do you think are going to be in orthodontics over the next 10 years? What are we likely to face?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's a difficult question to answer, Farouk. I think it's kind of a double-edged sword at the moment. Kind of the popularity and accessibility of orthodontics. In one sense, it's good in that orthodontics is something that providers want to give. Equally, it's something that patients, are more and more aware of. So I think, the specialty has huge traction, and I guess that is a good thing. I think the flip side of that coin is that, a lot of the treatments that are being provided these days have been, in a sense, I don't want to say dumbed down, but they've been made, I guess, more accessible to practitioners. And again, in one sense, that makes, the life of an orthodontist perhaps a little bit more enjoyable because we're using techniques that are a little bit more varied. And equally, that have made the process of treatment that little bit more palatable for patients, particularly adults. But equally, it does, mean that a lot more people are providing orthodontics. And as we know, not necessarily with the level of training that we think is important, to underpin, the treatments that we're providing. So I think that in itself is a big challenge. I think, innovation, will continue to happen, and that's really, really good. But my own view around innovation thus far is that largely it has, I think, made treatment more accessible. It has made, as I said, the process of treatment perhaps a little bit easier for practitioner and for patient, but it hasn't necessarily, I think, translated into better outcomes.
Mm,
And I
mm.
think that's kind of the circle that we need to square over
That's
time.
a really powerful point. Is it, what effect does it have overall? I think that's really insightful. And you mentioned about the number of people that you've worked with within orthodontics and the people who have held those carrots. But I want to know who is it you've admired the most in your journey in orthodontics?
Again, difficult question, Farouk. I have to go back to some of the people that trained me. People like Andrew Tobias, Bob Lee, Amajohal, incredibly supportive, offered very different things. But fundamentally, having all of those different voices, made a huge, huge difference to me on a personal level. Um, I think, people outside of that, some of my heroes in orthodontics are people like Bjorn Ludwig. We're aware of, Kiefer Orthopede, which is just a fantastic Facebook group. I admire his innovation. I admire the fact that he is a fantastic clinician and is also so innovative and equally has an academic, strand as well. So I think that is quite unique. I do love new techniques. And again, I look at people like Benedict Wilmes, for example, have developed really innovative techniques. And I just think, that this is, what we need in orthodontics in one sense. Similarly, obviously, as an academic, there are academics out there that I hugely respect. People like Kevin Martin, those types of people, Ravi Nanda, so many. And equally, what I always say to my postgraduates, I know I co-authored, Graeber recently, but I think everyone, should have read Prophet's textbook. It's people, sage people like, historically Prophet, Lyle Johnson, Jay Bowman, these sorts of individuals who have given the specialty so much, and many of whom are still educating us even to this day.
Great, great. And just to conclude the interview, Parag, what one piece of advice would you want to give to all the orthodontists out there?
Well, first of all, I think, be grateful for the career you've chosen. It is a fantastic career. We're blessed to do it. Um, I think if I was to give one piece of advice, it is probably not to sit on your laurels, to continue to reflect on what you do, no matter what stage you're at, whether you're a first, second year postgraduate or, someone who's qualified 30, 40 years. I think self-appraisal is incredibly important. I think, while, I talked about research earlier in this interview, that may be inaccessible to people, but we can all look at our own practices. We can look at, for example, how long it takes us to treat a case, what our typical standard of outcome might be, why and when we have to replace brackets, how often our attachments fall off. All these sorts of simple things. I think it's important that we continue to evaluate these throughout our career.
Excellent. Parag, thank you so much for joining me
Thank
for
you,
this
Ferg.
interview. I look forward to seeing you again in the real world sometime soon. Thank you so much, my friend.
Thanks, Ferg.
Just a few outtakes, guys, from today's episode. I hope you do enjoy. Good. And now, just a little bit more about you, Parag. So, you're a busy man, to say the least. But I wanted to know, what do you do when you're not thinking about orthodontics? So, what kind of things do you get up to with the family?
Well, lots. I first of all, hugely into sports, but sadly, primarily based on the armchair these days. Like you, Farouk, I have an interest in sport. I believe you're into ballet. Is that right? That's what someone told me recently. Is this
So,
true?
I mean, so what happened is that my daughter goes to ballet classes, and
More ballet classes.
I was there picking her up, and I'm pretty good at it. That's what I'm going to say.
Good, good.
I think this interview is mainly focused around your activities, Parag. So if we can just take the shot of my cheeks, it would be great.
Yeah, no, I think in terms